From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kailey Leinz. Tonight, the longest winning streak in over 20 years. Stocks rising for a ninth straight day, marking a full recovery exactly 1 month after the president's Liberation Day tariff announcement that made those markets nosedive. How potential easing trade tensions with China and a stronger than expected jobs report factor into the rally coming up. Plus, the fate of Trump's newly unveiled budget and long-sought tax cuts on Capitol Hill, when Republican Congressman and Financial Services Committee member Mike Flood of Nebraska joins us. And we'll get to the marathon race for a prized Michigan Senate seat.
We have to be thoughtful as we put policy forward and not have this approach that I think we've seen out of the Trump administration of ready, fire, aim.
Our conversation with Michigan State Senator Mallory McMorrow, her call for a new generation of elected officials, and how she aims to push the current administration up ahead. But we kick off the show on this Friday on today's rally and its drivers, with our Bloomberg reporters covering it on several fronts from Washington to New York. And it's in New York that we begin as we turn to Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick at our worldwide headquarters. Romaine, we just completed the longest winning streak on the S&P 500 since 2004. And 2 days ago, President Trump said this is still Joe Biden's stock market.
Yeah, well, what a difference 4 weeks can make, Kailey Leinz. You might want to take that back after seeing the results that we got today and really on the week. And S&P 500 rallying about 1.5% on the day, more than 3% on the week, and all of the other major U.S. indices saw similar gains. But a lot of people are really talking about this streak. 9 straight days now that the S&P 500 has risen, completely recouping all of the losses that were sparked by that Liberation Day announcement. It has been that tamp down in rhetoric on the trade front. It has been the idea that maybe there is indeed progress on potential negotiations, whether it's with China, with the EU, and some of the other major countries, that indeed might actually be what's driving stocks higher. However, Kailey, the big asterisk and, of course, the big bugaboo is that despite this sort of round trip we've taken from where we were pre-Liberation Day to where we were just a few weeks ago to where we are now, is that, well, since the start of the year and, well, since the start of this administration, the markets are still in the red. So there is still some room to go, Kailey. But if we start to see sentiment shift the way it shifted over these past 9 days, then maybe you can bank on additional gains.
Well, I guess we'll see when it comes to the equity market. Meantime, in the bond market today, striking to see a 13 basis point move higher on the 2-year Treasury yield to 3.82, just after the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said the 2-year was signaling the market thinks the Fed should cut rates. That decision is looming next week. Romaine, what kind of catalyst could it be?
Well, I can tell you right now, the swaps and options markets completely disagree. In fact, they're actually starting to price out some of those rate cuts that had been priced in just a little while ago. And that's largely because of the economic data, Kailey. At the end of the day, the Fed, if you believe what they say, is driven by the data, not by political pressure. And the data that we got this week, including that GDP report that, yes, I know on the top line was bad, but when you look at the monthly personal income and spending numbers, when you look at the labor market data that we got today here, you have an economy that, at least on the surface, does appear to be resilient. Consumer spending is still there. Business investment is still there. And that means, at least for right now, the labor market might hold up. And that just might be enough for the Fed to, well, just not do anything, Kailey.
Well, we'll see how President Trump feels if that's what they decide to do is nothing. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick joining us from New York. Thank you so much. And joining me now with the latest from the White House is Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson here in Washington. And Wendy, we've been hearing from the White House for weeks now, a suggestion that they are talking to China, or at the very least want to talk to China to try to make a trade deal. And just within the last 24 hours, it seems that we're actually now really talking, including on the Chinese side. The Commerce Ministry saying that they're evaluating the prospect of opening negotiations. Some reporting from the Wall Street Journal today that they're looking at fentanyl specifically to try to open a door here. Is this the first real sign of progress?
It very well might be. I mean, there is this just what you said. They are now talking about talking, which is the first step toward any negotiation. This is what has concerned people when the president says, I'm going to make all these deals in a week or two, because trade deals take months, if not years. And first you have to talk about talking. Then you have to talk about what you're going to talk about. Then you're going to have to talk about where you're going to talk and who's going to talk. And so the Chinese officials today were talking about finding the people to talk about, finding the subjects to talk about. And they want the talks to be traditional in the sense that they will start with relatively low-level staff, and then they will move up and up and up to the heads of state. Trump doesn't operate that way, and I can foresee some complications here. Trump wants to be the one in the room with Xi Jinping, and the two of them work it out. And that's just not how the Chinese see these things working. So, well, I think there's a little bit of ways to go, but the thawing on the Chinese side today was incredibly significant.
So the president may not be finding himself in a room with Xi Jinping anytime soon, but he will on Tuesday find himself in the White House with the newly firmly elected Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, who had this to say about his planned trip to Washington on Tuesday.
We're meeting as heads of our government to discuss that partnership. Now, I'm not pretending those discussions will be easy or they won't proceed in a straight line. There'll be zigs and zags, ups and downs. But as I said in my remarks, I will fight for the best deal for Canada and only accept the best deal for Canada and take as much time as necessary.
How does, though, Wendy, getting a deal with Canada perhaps be complicated by suggestions that Canada, for example, should become the 51st state?
Well, it's funny. Trump has stopped talking about that since the Canadian elections. And I think the fact that Justin Trudeau has moved off stage is very helpful toward getting some sort of talk going. They didn't have a good relationship. He was very angry at Donald Trump, and Donald Trump just kept goading him and calling him Governor Trudeau and, you know, putting these really onerous tariffs, some of which he's backed off from. So now you have a fresh face and someone who is a central banker, someone who, you know, really knows the trade issues. And he's willing to come in. He says we're over the shock of the things that Donald Trump has said and done. He knows the Canadian-U.S. relationship is forever changed. That's his terminology. And he was ready, but he is ready to sort of start fresh under the parameters of this new relationship where Canada and the U.S. are not necessarily friendly neighbors anymore, but they are neighbors and they need to work together. And I think that's the way Carney is coming into this.
And finally, Wendy, one more subject for you today as we got something that the president has been suggesting might happen for some time, but confirmation, at least on Truth Social. We are going to be taking away Harvard's tax-exempt status. He says, quote, it's what they deserve. Does he actually have the legal authority to do that?
No, he doesn't. It's firmly in the law that a president cannot tell the IRS what to do, especially for political reasons. And this started, I believe, I may be wrong, but I believe this started in the Nixon administration when Richard Nixon wanted to punish political enemies by sicking the IRS on them and auditing them and things like that. So Trump is obviously, as I think all our viewers know, very angry at Harvard right now. They've apologized, although they've said they will not accede to his wishes for them to change their curriculum and things like that. So today, yes, he said what he's been wanting to say for a while, which is we want to take away your tax-exempt status. This is another process that takes years. I mean, the federal government just doesn't move at Donald Trump's preferred speed. And so it would have to be decided from within the IRS. It would take negotiations with Harvard. It would take a chance for Harvard to appeal any decision. Harvard, I'm quite sure, would sue. They've got a gang of lawyers, both conservatives and liberals, ready to take this on. And so it may happen. It probably won't happen by the time Trump's term ends.
All right. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, thank you very much. Of course, that story on Harvard, one of the most read on the Bloomberg terminal all day long, in addition to, of course, our coverage of the markets, which had another rally today on the heels of a better than expected jobs report. Growth robust in April. Actually, this was, the month of April. 177,000 on non-farm payrolls, which was hotter than expected. Unemployment holding steady at 4.2%. All this despite deep uncertainty over the president's trade policies. Economists still expect hiring plans to slow down over the coming months. And this morning on Bloomberg, Stephen Myron, the chair of the Council of the Economic Advisors at the White House, had this to say about today's economic data.
There's been an ongoing disconnect between the hard data and the soft data, and the hard data continue to perform very well. 177,000 jobs last month, a beat of 40,000 jobs. That's the president's second jobs day beat in a row. And on top of that, you've got 11,000 construction jobs, expanding construction sector in spite of the president's crackdown on the border.
Up ahead, the president acts on his threats against Harvard University, as we were just discussing. But up next, the competition for a U.S. Senate seat in Michigan is heating up. We'll bring you our conversation with one of the candidates, Michigan State Senator Mallory McMorrow, and how she's pushing for a party to adopt a new generation of leaders. Next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kailey Leinz. Today on the early edition of the program, we spoke with Mallory McMorrow, Michigan State Senator and now Democratic candidate for Michigan's U.S. Senate seat, or the one that will be open in 2026. This is what she told us about her campaign and why she's running.
My campaign is really centered on this idea of making a new American dream, acknowledging that we can't recreate the prosperity of our past by going backwards, and leaning into my own story. I'm a millennial who graduated right into the recession. I had no job prospects. I had no health insurance. I lived in the back of my car for a few nights, applied to 300 jobs, and I talked to Michiganders across this state who share that sentiment and frustration of having done everything right and still feeling like they're behind and they're not getting ahead and they don't have stability. So this is going to be about three things: success, safety, and sanity, and writing that new American dream together in a way that people can see themselves in, that isn't just about Donald Trump. It's not about, relitigating what he's doing or not doing. It's about what our future looks like.
Well, and we do want to get into the fact that you are a millennial and kind of the generational question now at play with the Democratic Party and what you might represent. But to touch back on your point around prosperity and what it will take to return it, for those who were gathered at the rally in Macomb County earlier this week, as Donald Trump talked about the Reagan Democrats and the auto workers who he thinks his policies will benefit, what is your message to that particular part of Michigan's constituency that you are seeking to represent, who feel like these policies actually would serve to benefit them?
There is a world where a thoughtful trade policy, thoughtful tariff policy could do things like bring a third or fourth shift back on some of our manufacturing facilities that have laid workers off or have idled. But what we're seeing now is the broad, expansive tariffs that went on after the announcement of the auto tariffs on everyday goods, from clothes to coffee to bananas to diapers, is going to devastate workers. So the approach that I have, that I hope Michiganders hear, is that we have to be thoughtful as we put policy forward and not have this approach that I think we've seen out of the Trump administration of ready, fire, aim, of let's just announce things, see how they go. And I think Michigan, really for the rest of the country, is a canary in the coal mine. We saw some strong jobs numbers come out this morning. However, Michigan has the second highest increase in unemployment in the entire country. Our unemployment rate is sitting right now around 5.5%. We've seen layoffs at Stellantis, at suppliers, at small business owners, and we see that ripple effect play out where, over in Long Beach, the longshoremen put out a really critical, strong letter about the impact that this is going to have to jobs in the economy if we don't see some measuring in the approach to tariff policy. So I am heartened by some of the news out of Beijing that you just mentioned, but we're going to have to see some stability and not the chaos that we've seen so far.
You can find the full conversation with Democratic Michigan Senate candidate Mallory McMorrow online or on the terminal. Still ahead, we'll look forward to the one-on-one between the president and Canada's Mark Carney next week. But first, President Trump sends Congress his budget proposal that would slash non-defense discretionary spending by 23%. We'll get reaction from Republican Congressman Mike Flood of Nebraska next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is the best, they say, 100-day start of any president in history. In the coming weeks and months, we will pass the largest tax cuts in American history. Our golden age has only just begun.
President Trump earlier this week speaking at his 100 Days rally in Macomb County, Michigan, teasing his long-promised tax cuts, one of his major campaign pledges. And he keeps adding to them. This week, floating the possibility of eliminating taxes on income under $200,000 due to increased revenues from tariffs. But implementing that, or any other part of his plan, is up to lawmakers and Congress. And one of them is joining us now here on Bloomberg TV and radio, Republican Congressman Mike Flood of Nebraska, a member of the House Financial Services Committee and also vice chair of the Republican Main Street Caucus. Congressman, thanks for being here on Balance of Power. We have seen the punting of key markups in the Energy and Commerce and Ways and Means Committee from next week to the week following. When it comes to this reconciliation package, is the Speaker's goal of getting all of this done by Memorial Day no longer realistic?
Well, I've heard some talk that 4th of July might be a more reasonable deadline. Either way, it has to be done, as far as I'm concerned, before we go home for the August recess when we meet our constituents throughout the entire month. And I feel we can get there. I am on the Financial Services Committee, and we were successful in getting our bill marked up. Now, granted, it didn't cut the kind of government spending that the Energy and Commerce Committee will, or the heavy lifting the Ways and Means Committee will undertake, but it was a substantial first start, and other committees are doing the same. Listen, this is a major undertaking. Reconciliation has been the priority for the House of Representatives so far this year, and I'm confident we will get it done.
Well, you speak to the difficulty in energy and commerce. The big hangup there, of course, is what to do about Medicaid. You come from a state in which more than 300,000 people, more than a third of them children, are enrolled in Medicaid. And I wonder what kind of cuts, if any, to the program you're willing to tolerate and what your colleagues in the Main Street Caucus are willing to tolerate.
Well, we're having that discussion right now. Obviously, there are folks on both sides of the spectrum there. Several of the people that signed that letter saying that they were concerned about deep cuts in Medicaid, some of which our Main Street members feel very strongly. There are other folks in the Main Street Caucus that want to be even more aggressive than what is being talked about in some ways. And so we are, much like the rest of the House of Representatives, spread across a spectrum. The reality is that I'm all for things like work requirements. Work requirements in a state like mine, contributing to the entire federal government nationwide, that could be $200 to $250 billion in savings for the federal treasury. There's a variety of things that can be done. There's a focus on these provider tax payments that are under consideration. I think we can pretty easily get to $500 billion. The question is, how do we get to $880 billion, which is where I know a good section of the conference wants to be. I know Mr. Guthrie, who is in charge of the Energy and Commerce Committee, has asked to come see the Main Street Caucus and have some discussions next week so that he can tell us about some of their plans. I know they're working night and day. I feel like we're going to get there. This is going to be a painful journey, but at the end of the day, it will be worth it.
Well, when we consider what the light of the end of the tunnel, if you will, here, why you're going on this journey, it is to make permanent or at least extend the 2017 tax cuts. But I spoke about this with Mick Mulvaney, the former acting White House chief of staff in the first Trump administration, also a founding member of the House Freedom Caucus. And this is what he had to say about this current tax bill.
The bill is not a tax cut. The bill is an extension of the current tax rates. It's the prevention of a tax increase. You hear Donald Trump go on TV and say, I'm going to give you a huge tax cut. Technically, he's correct because the current law is that your taxes are going to go up, and he's preventing that from happening. But if you were expecting more money in your wallet, if this bill passes, you are going to be extraordinarily disappointed. And that's going to be a hard sell for the Republicans.
Congressman, can you honestly tell your constituents they will have more money at the end of this as we're considering whether or not some benefits may be cut?
Well, I think myself, like many other members of Congress, have been describing it exactly right. I say if we don't act the average Nebraska family will see a 20% tax hike. Your federal estate tax exemption will be cut in half, which makes it very difficult to pass on the family farm with the high land prices we have. But to depart from Mr. Mulvaney a bit, we are talking about some other tax cuts that would be new. If they are implemented, that would, if we take no taxes on tips, or if we make progress on tax on Social Security, all of those discussions would be new in the realm of tax cuts. And I don't think anybody on the Ways and Means Committee have really showed their cards. They've been working night and day to try and find a solution. So until they release where they want to go, I think it's premature to say what will be or what will not be in that package.
When we consider your constituents, Congressman, you are one of the few brave House Republicans who actually did hold a town hall last month. And I know you got an earful on a number of matters. Did you take those as real concerns from your constituency? Did you think those people might be operatives, if you will? Or did you take some of their messages to heart? And if so, what was your takeaway?
I did take some of their messages to heart. And no, most of the people there were from Lincoln. They were from Omaha. They were from Columbus. They were from communities around Columbus, Nebraska. And very happy to be able to do that. Here's what I heard. That most notable, there was a lot of concern that night about benefits and services of the VA hospital system and the VA health system. I intend to, in the August recess, tour all the VA facilities in my district. I've reached out to the leadership of the Veterans Administration, and I've invited the VA Secretary to address the Main Street group so that we can have an opportunity to check in on all of that. Making good on our promises to veterans was something that I heard loud and clear from that town hall, and I am acting on it. I also think there were a lot of people in that room, very good people, that had a lot of concerns. One of the concerns they had was my Social Security benefits are going to get cut. That's absolutely not true. Under the Budget Reform Act of 1974, in the process of reconciliation, we are prohibited from touching Social Security benefits. But a lot of people in that room had that very well-heeled concern. So yes, I took some very good takeaways from it. There were also some people that wanted to create a scene, and I walked into that room and I told myself, I don't want anybody here to get arrested. I don't want anybody here to be taken out. I want them to be able to say what they want to say, and as long as everybody here feels safe, let's just muscle through this and let that energy come out. And at the end of the event, I had a number of people come up, say, you know what, I don't agree with you on anything, or I agree with you on a few things, but not everything. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here and be heard.
Well, we thank you for taking the opportunity to join us here on Balance of Power tonight as well. Republican Congressman Mike Flood of Nebraska, who's the vice chair of the Republican Main Street Caucus. Thank you so much for joining us. He's also a radio guy, mind you, actually founded a few stations of his own. And on that news, the White House going to battle with PBS and NPR as the president signs an executive order defunding both. We'll have that up ahead. But up next, the U.S. adds a more than expected 177,000 jobs in April, despite uncertainty over the president's trade policies. We'll discuss the data with Daniel Hornung, former deputy director of the National Economic Council under the Biden administration, next on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kailey Leinz. April jobs data out this morning showing the labor market remains resilient with a stronger than expected 177,000 print on non-farm payrolls. And Stephen Myron, chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, joined Bloomberg earlier today with his reaction to the figures.
There's been an ongoing disconnect between the hard data and the soft data, and the hard data continue to perform very well. 177,000 jobs last month, a beat of 40,000 jobs. That's the president's second jobs day beat in a row. And on top of that, you've got 11,000 construction jobs, expanding construction sector in spite of the president's crackdown on the border, disproving critics again. And the hard data continue to be okay. And I think it's worth emphasizing that these data represent the period after the president's historic actions with tariffs on April 2nd.
So, Stephen, we need to get into that because there are some people that we've spoken to that worry about the next report. They think that this could show up in the May report. And I've heard the words downside risk repeatedly. Are you confident that some of that's avoidable?
So, look, given the historic scope and speed with which the president acted to put American workers and firms first for the first time in decades, it shouldn't be surprising if there's some accompanying volatility, and that extends to financial markets that we've seen, and it could extend to economic data also as companies sort of substitute activity from one month to another. That remains to be seen. But so far in the hard data, we're not seeing any real evidence of that to be the case. And as you pointed out, there are various soft data sentiment indices that look not as good, but those tend to be influenced by financial markets, and there's been enormous volatility there lately, as you guys are aware, and they tend to be influenced a lot by politics. But historically, the correlation between those and activity has been weaker in the last few years than it would have been, say, 10 years ago.
You can find the full conversation with Stephen Miron, chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, online or on the terminal. And for more analysis on today's jobs data, we turn now to Daniel Hornung. He's former deputy director of the National Economic Council during the Biden administration, now senior fellow at MIT, and is here with me in our Washington, D.C. studio. Good to see you. We just heard from Mr. Miron there, the suggestion that this is the second jobs report in a row that there's been a beat under Donald Trump. But President Trump himself said earlier this week that this is still Joe Biden's economy and stock market that we're working with. Whose economy is this, really? Who gets the credit for any data we get?
It's a funny, very D.C. question. I think the reality is, if you look at the economy that President Trump inherited, it was an economy with roughly 3% growth, unemployment around 4%, inflation coming down towards 2%. And I think the chair of the CEA is right that the hard data has not changed all that much. The thing that has changed a lot in the last 4 months is things like forecasts for growth, recession risks, what consumers are saying about the economy, what businesses are saying about the economy. And so the way that I think about today's report really is, it's true, it was a resilient report. There were some concerning signs like the downward revisions to past months. You're starting to see some federal layoffs associated with DOGE. But I think the question is, when do those tariff-induced price increases start to hit in a way that hits at incomes, hits at consumer spending, and starts to then really impact the labor market? And can the administration act quickly enough to reverse some of its tariff policies in order to prevent that from happening? Because if they can't, I think we are probably headed to a worse weakening in the labor market and likely a recession.
Well, so what is your assessment of when that could happen? Because already we're seeing port authorities. Gene Soroka, who runs one of the ports out off Los Angeles, was on earlier today talking about how already you're seeing cargo volume, ships coming from China. That is slowing down. And if they're not coming now, they're not bringing the goods that are needed for back to school season or Halloween, maybe even into Christmas. So how quickly could this actually catch up in the hard figures?
I think we're seeing some concerning leading indicators like the one you mentioned. We know anecdotally things like the de minimis exemption ending today could lead to price increases starting as soon as next week or a few weeks after that. And then it really is a cycle of things that should happen in the economy where first the prices go up, you see then the hits to real incomes, and that's when consumption starts to slow and businesses will hire less or conduct layoffs. And so I think there probably still is some time for the administration to move if they move very, very quickly. But it also takes a very long time for trade deals to happen, as you know. And so I think the important thing will be for them to signal some deals as quickly as possible. And then the big issue, of course, is China, where that really is where the reason why the effective tariff rate has gone up so much. And so you need quick resolution on that. And that's what I think most analysts would say is very, very difficult for this administration to get.
Well, you're starting to see maybe some more positive signals on China specifically, but President Trump obviously has been fielding a lot of questions about those negotiations with China and the impact of these tariffs overall. And he interestingly had this response earlier this week when asked about the potential for empty shelves as part of this. And this is what he said.
Somebody said, oh, the shelves are going to be open. Well, maybe the children will have $2 instead of $30, and maybe the $2 will cost a couple of bucks more than they would normally.
I don't know if you see that as recognition of just economic reality on the part of President Trump, but the fact of the matter is it might not just be dolls we're talking about. How could we see kind of an emptying of shelves of things that are critical to the U.S. economy or to the manufacturing sector specifically that the president says these policies are intended to reignite?
Yeah, well, it'll be things like dolls the president mentioned, toys, appliances, clothes. The list really goes on. And, I think the comment somehow indicates, and other comments from the administration indicate that, maybe people should just buy less stuff or buy more expensive stuff, and that would be okay. I think it's really not that complicated. The reason people buy inexpensive things is because they don't make enough money to afford things that are more expensive. And so when you basically tell people that their prices are going to go up, but that's okay, what you're doing is lowering living standards for lower income people, middle income people, just the people who President Trump's economic message was really designed to appeal to.
Well, and he's kind of referred to that as being some short-term pain that might be experienced, or disruptions is another way that he's phrased this. All of it, he says, is in it trying to achieve a longer-term objective, which is more U.S. manufacturing, more balanced trade, potentially more in the Treasury's coffers. Do you see a way economically where actually that can all come about based off of these policies?
I think one of the challenges, the list that you gave, more manufacturing here, more revenue, those are contradictory. Are we trying to get more manufacturing in the United States? Are we trying to permanently replace the income tax? It's hard to know because you hear different things from different members of the administration. What I would say, if the goal is to try to produce more critical things in the United States, that's a very important goal that should be coupled with investment in key sectors. The challenge is when you say we're going to try to bring production of almost everything to the United States, what that will do is make people poorer, reduce corporate profits for businesses, and lead to a smaller economy where people's incomes are lower.
Well, and whether it's that economic reality we ultimately face or a different one, we all have the question as to how the Federal Reserve is going to respond to it. Now that you're outside of the White House apparatus, you're hopefully a little bit more free to answer this question. I'm so used to saying I respect
the independence, but go ahead.
Well, and President Trump says he has no intention of firing the chairman, but that hasn't stopped him from repeatedly saying that Powell risks being too late, and he thinks they need to cut interest rates now, knowing that monetary policy and the rate mechanism itself will operate with a lag, that if they wait for the data in hand, by the time easier policy kicks in, it may not be able to have an immediate effect. Do you see a point to that argument? Is Chairman Powell going to end up being too late no matter what?
I think that President Trump has put Chairman Powell in a real bind, because the reality is that normally if we see labor market softening, what we would see alongside that is a benign inflation outlook that would make the choice quite easy to cut rates. But if what we see is a couple firm CPI and PCE readings on the good side, and maybe some labor market weakening that lags that higher inflation, I think it will be challenging for the Fed to act as quickly as they need to. And so that, I think, really speaks to the difficult position that President Trump and the tariff policies have put the Fed in.
If you got the chance to ask the chairman a question at his press conference next week, knowing he has to dance around a lot of tough questions these days, what does he most need to answer for? What do you want to hear from him?
I think I'd want to know when precisely the labor market weakening is enough that he would need to act regardless of where the inflation picture was. So, is it the unemployment rate going up? Is he going to act more quickly if we simply see some moves in the claims data as we did this week? I think that's going to be the most important question for him. I do think if I were Chair Powell, though, the most important question for me would be, when is President Trump going to act to more swiftly try to take some of these tariff rates down? Because without that, it's very hard to see much progress here.
Well, and I'm not sure anyone except President Trump is able to answer that question. Daniel Hornung, former deputy director of the National Economic Council under the Biden administration, now senior fellow at MIT. Thank you. And President Trump says Harvard will lose its tax-exempt status as he escalates his feud with the university. We'll discuss that when we assemble our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think there need to be strong actions taken by the trustees of the university to very promptly and aggressively replace those in positions of administrative responsibility who take tendentious positions on issues.
Larry Summers, former U.S. Treasury Secretary and former president of Harvard, reacting to a long-awaited report on anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim bias at the university, which presented a scathing critique of how its students treated each other in the aftermath of the Hamas attack against Israel in 2023. Following the report, Harvard's president Alan Garber apologized for the university's failures and announced plans to focus on promoting respectful dialogue and revising policies. But that doesn't seem to be enough to tamp down its feud with the Trump administration. President Trump announcing on Truth Social today, quote, "We are going to be taking away Harvard's tax-exempt status. It's what they deserve." Joining me now with their reaction here on Bloomberg TV and radio is this evening's political panel. Bloomberg politics contributor Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, political science professor at Iona University and Democratic analyst, alongside Republican strategist Matt Gorman, executive vice president at Targeted Victory. Welcome to you both. Jeannie, you obviously work in academia, so I'll hit you with this one first. There's obviously a question of the president's legal authority to do this, but just by him trying, what message does it send?
It sends the message that this fight that he has taken to the elite universities, he is going to continue it. And, you know, I think Larry Summers is absolutely right. Harvard, all elite institutions and any other institutions who engaged in practices that allowed for or supported or in any way anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim activities do need to take strict and serious steps to alleviate that and deal with it. And I think Harvard has taken that first step with the release of this report and the apology. But that doesn't give the president the right to remove their tax-exempt status merely by law, because the law says that the IRS can revoke it, but it can only do so on grounds for violation of the law or public policy. And in this case, they haven't shown either. So I don't think this holds up in court.
So as Jeannie kind of runs us through the legal question, Matt, as to whether or not the president has the legal authority to do this, whether they've shown that this move is justified, why start another court fight? Why is this fight with Harvard worth it? Why spend your political capital on this?
I don't think he spends much political capital on it, but I think it's been the playbook of much of his second term, where you're going to try and issue statements, executive orders that you know are going to get scrutiny in the courts. And maybe you don't get 100% of what you want. Maybe you get 80%. Or even 40%. It's 40% than you wouldn't have gotten otherwise. And I think this is one of those issues where he almost alluded to it last night when he was talking to the University of Alabama, using the Harvard Crimson and the Crimson Tide opposite to close out his speech. Going in front of the American people and taking tax-exempt status away from a university that has, I guess, billions of dollars in endowment.
Yeah,
Harvard,
more than 50 billion.
Exactly. It is something that is politically, it's one of those 80-20 issues that he's really kind of mastered these last couple months of getting on the right side of it and forcing people to defend him, not even on necessarily the actual grounds, but just on purely process grounds. It's a question of whether or not he can do it, not whether he should.
Well, I know that this is a popular story with our Bloomberg terminal audience. It's been one of the most read stories on the Bloomberg all day. But we have a very specific audience here. But you're essentially saying this is an 80-20 issue well beyond that this isn't just about elite institutions. He's tapping into something else.
Go to Iowa, go to Texas, go to most places in this country that aren't, don't have Ivy League schools or are, their median income might not be as high as you'd see in Cambridge, and tell them that $50 billion endowment should be tax exempt, that Harvard should be tax exempt. The politics of it are pretty good.
Well, when we consider what else the president is spending his time doing, Jeannie, these days, he also signed an executive order last night pulling federal funding from NPR and PBS. Remember, back in March, he had shared his plans around this. This is what he said at the time.
Look at all the media you have right now. There's plenty of coverage. I was from a different age, and they spend more money than any other network of its type ever conceived. So the kind of money that's being wasted, and it's a very biased view, you know that better than anybody, and I'd be honored to see it end.
He says it's a biased view, or biased and partisan news coverage is actually the language that was used in the announcement of this, Jeannie. What happens if that coverage loses its funding and can't continue? What's lost?
You know, this is what the Republicans have been going for decades. This is the sort of Republican playbook, if you will. It's listed right in the first page of this chapter in Project 2025 that they will defund. And we heard Marjorie Taylor Greene hold that hearing. And of course, what it creates is less understanding for people, particularly in rural areas, without a lot of access to the media that the president is talking about, access to entertainment, access to news, and that kind of thing. And so it is a real problem. But even beyond that, what joins both of these cases together is something that people don't want to address in the Trump administration, which is the fact that he does not have the power to do either of these things. In the case of tax-exempt, that is for the IRS. In the case of public funding, it is for Congress. So as much as he can make cases, and Matt's talking about, rightly so, that these may be popular in the case of Harvard, the reality is, popular or not, it is unconstitutional according to the framers of the Constitution, and this coming from a party that holds itself up as particularly concerned about original interpretations of the Constitution. It doesn't get any more original than funding comes from Congress. Allocations come from Congress. And the law says the IRS is responsible for revocation of tax-exempt status. So, Mr. President, follow the law. Do it through Congress if you want to do it, but don't end run around in a way that's unconstitutional.
Well, and when we consider, Matt, what Congress has actually appropriated, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is what they receive funds through, gets less than $500 million in federal funds. This is a drop in the bucket.
Exactly. It's a drop in the bucket for NPR, too. So why not just be rid of this boogeyman that they always... I work for Mitt Romney. We use that as a cudgel against them. I remember vividly the day after that terrible debate by Barack Obama, he was talking about Big Bird on the stump. To your point, exactly, if a percentage or 2 percentage points of their budget go away from Congress, it's not going to evaporate off TV screens across the country. My tax dollars don't pay for Bloomberg or NBC or ABC, and I can watch them all just fine. So I think it is something that it makes a lot of sense. I think it's popular, but also if I were NPR or PBS, just be rid of this forever if it really is a drop in the bucket to your overall budget.
Well, but when we consider that drop in the bucket, Jeannie, knowing that we came into the Trump White House with Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency saying we're going to find $2 trillion in spending cuts, we're going to be cutting here, looking at programs like PBS and NPR, does this not just speak to how hard it actually is to find substantive places to cut?
Oh, absolutely. We all know that trying to find cuts in D.C. is pretty much of a non-starter. Even holding the line one year to the next is a non-starter. And, you know, I don't know, does the president really want to take up a campaign against Big Bird and Elmo? I appreciate that a small percentage of the public funding is coming from the government to NPR and a little bit more to PBS. But the reality is that it is up to Congress to allocate. And the president shouldn't be doing this in the middle of the night via EO. He should follow the Constitution and the law, and he should take a stand if he wants to, but do it following proper law and procedure.
And finally, Matt, as we close out this week in Washington here, this will go down as the week in which we saw the first real change-up in the Trump administration. Mike Waltz goes from National Security Advisor to now nominee for UN Ambassador. Marco Rubio is suddenly Secretary of State, NSA, all at the same time. Do you think the president, as we face questions around the performance of Pete Hegseth, for example, is going to be eager for more turnover? Is this the last we'll see of it for a while?
This is precisely the reason why so many in the White House were very hesitant on giving the press, if you will, a quote-unquote scalp, right? Because all of a sudden, the Waltz talk is kind of over. Okay, thanks for Mike Waltz. What about Pete Hegseth now? And then what about somebody else, right? So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy a little bit. I think, first of all, when it came to Waltz, he's been on thin ice for a little while. I think it both alleviates two problems. They obviously were kind of a little bit tired of him around the White House. It also sends him to New York, and it fills that UN ambassador role that Stefanik was supposed to have. But I think you're also right. It does take the heat off of other folks for a little bit, and we'll see where things go. You're right. This was notable, the first turnover of this administration just 100 days in.
Yeah, keeping in mind there were 6 acting or actual national security advisors in the first Trump White House. We now stand at 2. Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Matt Gorman, thank you both so much for joining us. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney is scheduled to meet with President Trump in Washington on Tuesday. We'll preview that meeting next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
it's important to get engaged immediately, which has always been my intention, has always been his intention. I go there with the expectation of constructive, difficult, but constructive discussions. That's the spirit of the conversations that the President and I had. You go to these meetings well prepared, understanding the objectives of your counterpart, and always acting in the best interest of Canada, and we'll go from there.
Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney previewing his message to President Trump when the two meet at the White House on Tuesday. Just one of a number of events we'll be watching next week, in addition to the Milken Institute Global Conference, which begins Monday in Los Angeles. We'll have coverage of it all week long, including interviews with Apollo's Mark Rowan, Citi CEO Jane Fraser, the U.S. Secretary of Energy Chris Wright, and others. So enjoy the weekend, and we'll see you back for coverage next week right here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.